the security and the safety that they need. And we're a very open family, so we talk about things that bother us and things that trouble us. But you never quite know the knock-on effects it can have.
And the Prince stressing the importance of his work-life balance.
Because for me, the most important thing in my life is family, and everything is about the future. And about, if you don't start the children off now with a happy, healthy, stable home, I feel you're setting them up for a bit of a hard time.
Prince William orders Camilla's family out of the estate after court victory, leaving them fuming. Okay, take a look at this for a moment. According to the story unfolding around this bitter royal inheritance dispute, Prince William has won the court battle over the estate, and the decision has now put Camilla's family on notice that their time inside the property is over. The issue is not simply that William wants them gone. The deeper problem is that confidential inheritance documents allegedly gave him the legal right to control the estate while placing severe limits on Camilla and her relatives. And once that evidence entered the case, what looked like a family disagreement suddenly became something far more serious. The order was not delivered after a friendly conversation. It came after financial scrutiny, disputed claims of entitlement, and a legal fight over who had the right to remain on and benefit from the property. Camilla's family had reportedly believed they had enough standing to resist removal. William's position was the opposite. The estate was supposed to pass to him, and the people occupying it were allegedly benefiting from an arrangement they had no permanent right to control. Now watch this, because this is where the story takes its first sharp turn. The court victory did not merely give William a piece of property. It gave him something much more powerful.
To serve others, both current and future generations, and those whose memory must not be neglected. Take the natural world. He warned us of the risks to our planet's health long before it was an everyday issue. Or the Prince's Trust. It has supported the Prince's Trust has supported over 1 million young people.
The authority to enforce what the late Queen's inheritance documents were said to require. And that meant the people who had been treating the estate as though it would remain within their reach were suddenly facing the one outcome they had been fighting to prevent. Hi viewers, if you knew a valuable family estate was legally meant for someone else, would you still stay there and fight to keep it? Be honest and put yes or no in the comments, because that simple answer says a lot about where you stand in a dispute like this. The answer mattered because the conflict was no longer happening behind closed doors without consequences. The court had reached its decision. The accountants had finished examining the numbers. The inheritance papers had become central to the dispute, and William now had a path to turn a legal victory into physical control of the estate. That was the moment the atmosphere changed. For Camilla's family, the most painful part was reportedly not even the possibility of leaving. It was the discovery that their understanding of the estate may have been built on incomplete information. They had been fighting as though the question was whether William could claim the property. But the documents at the center of the dispute raised a different question altogether. What if William had already been chosen? What if the late Queen had already decided who could inherit, who could manage the estate, and who could never take control of it? And what if those restrictions had been written years before anyone knew this confrontation was coming? That possibility transformed every earlier move. The occupation looked different. The financial arrangements looked different. The private meetings looked different. Even the legal challenge itself began to look like a confrontation that one side had prepared for long before the other side realized there was a battle. The estate had become the center of a struggle involving money, family influence, inheritance rights, and royal authority. But beneath all of that was one question that refused to disappear. Why had the late Queen placed such unusual protections around this particular property? That question was dangerous because the answer could explain why William was suddenly moving with such certainty. There was no need for him to make a public spectacle. No dramatic announcement was required. The legal decision had already done the heavy lifting. Once the court accepted the evidence supporting William's claim, the next steps became increasingly difficult for his opponents to stop. The family could object, they could consult lawyers, they could challenge the interpretation, They could argue that their connection to the estate gave them legitimate grounds to remain. But there was a problem. Every argument depended on what the inheritance documents actually said. And according to the account at the heart of this story, those documents contained language that Camilla's family had not expected to confront. That was the real shock.
An old man was probably not a great deal older than me, but and I think...
And attacked in what way?
On a train.
You were on a train?
On a train.
And someone you didn't know?
Somebody I didn't know. I was reading my book and, this man attacked me, and I did fight back, and I got off. I remember getting off the train and my mother looking at me and saying, why is your hair still?
The estate was not simply being handed to William because he was the future king. The claim rested on a private inheritance arrangement that allegedly gave him a specific legal position. More importantly, the same arrangement reportedly restricted the ability of Camilla or members of her family to take control. That distinction matters. Because if William had simply demanded that they leave, the dispute could have been portrayed as another royal family power struggle. But if the late Queen had already established the rules, then William was not creating the conflict. He was enforcing them. And that is precisely why the court victory carried such weight. The dispute had begun with possession. It was now moving toward authority. Inside the estate, that shift would have been impossible to ignore. People who had once moved through the property with confidence were suddenly facing lawyers, documents, deadlines, and the possibility that their access could disappear entirely. The family's anger, according to the account, grew because they were not prepared for the evidence to work so decisively against them. They had expected an argument over ownership. Instead, they encountered an inheritance structure. They expected negotiations. Instead, they encountered a ruling. They expected time. Instead, William's victory created urgency. And once that urgency arrived, every hour mattered. The next question was no longer whether William had won. He had. The question was what he intended to do with that victory. Would he allow Camilla's relatives additional time? Would there be another private settlement? Would the family attempt another legal maneuver? Or would William finally order the estate cleared? The answer would soon become unmistakable. But there was another problem waiting underneath the legal battle. The accountants had been looking at more than ownership documents. They had been examining how the estate had been used, who had benefited from it, and whether the financial history matched the claims being made by those occupying it. That financial trail threatened to make the dispute even uglier, because numbers do not argue emotionally. They do not care about family relationships. They do not care about royal titles. They either match the documents or they do not. And according to the story, some of the figures raised questions that demanded answers. Payments, expenses, benefits connected to the property, arrangements that required closer examination. One discovery could explain why palace officials became increasingly interested in the estate's financial history. Another could explain why the legal challenge became so aggressive. And one document could potentially connect everything: the inheritance, the occupation, the money, and the late Queen's private instructions. That was the document William's side had been waiting for. Because if it contained the restriction being described, then Camilla's family was not simply losing an argument. They were losing the foundation on which their claim depended. For the people on the other side of the dispute, that realization must have been devastating. They had entered the battle believing there was room to negotiate. Now the space was narrowing. The court had spoken. The financial investigation had raised questions. The inheritance documents were being scrutinized. And William was no longer merely defending his claim, he was preparing to act on it. The most revealing part of the story, however, was still hidden from public view. It concerned a sealed portion of the inheritance evidence, a provision that allegedly remained confidential until the legal battle forced the issue into the open. That provision is where the entire dispute changes. Because the next evidence did not simply identify William as the heir, it reportedly explained why Camilla's family could never be allowed to control the estate in the first place. And if that clause is as decisive as the account suggests, then the court victory was only the beginning. So if you believe a royal inheritance should be respected when the documents are clear, do not scroll away now. Stay with this story and subscribe, because what happened after the accountants uncovered the next set of records made the dispute far worse than a simple eviction.
You're here on this historic visit, 250 years of our country.
That's extraordinary.
How has your trip been?
Well, it's been whistle-stop. It's been really good fun, but we have moved quite fast.
You've been to a lot of places, to quite a few.
We have, but it's been wonderful, and everybody's been very kind and welcoming.
Well,
It's always a pleasure to be here, and always lovely to be back in New York again.
well, we brought...
The next part reveals how Camilla's family came to believe they had a right to remain there at all, and that is where this story gets much harder to ignore. The first mistake was believing the family's presence at the estate meant they had a permanent claim to it. That distinction became crucial once the records were examined. The property had not simply been treated as a private residence. Over time, Camilla's relatives had occupied parts of it, benefited from its facilities, and operated around an assumption that their access would continue. From the outside, that arrangement could look established. Inside the paperwork, however, the position was far less secure. The estate carried obligations that went beyond ordinary household expenses. Maintenance, staffing, security, repairs, and other property costs created a paper trail. Those records became important because they showed who was using the estate, who was receiving benefits from it, and which arrangements had been formally authorized. That was where the palace accountants began asking questions. Their review was not presented as a personal attack on Camilla. It was a financial examination of an asset whose ownership was under dispute. Every payment mattered. Every authorization mattered. Every document attached to the property had to be matched against the inheritance arrangements. And one issue stood out. The family's continued presence did not automatically prove ownership. That sounds simple, but it changed the entire argument. Occupying a royal property and possessing a legal right to inherit it were two very different things. A family could spend years using an estate and still discover that another person held the underlying title or beneficial interest. The records reportedly showed that some of the family's activities had generated value connected to the property. That raised another question. If William was the designated heir, on what basis had others continued receiving benefits from an asset that was supposed to pass to him? The answer was not immediately clear. There were agreements, there were informal understandings, there were expectations built over time. But expectations are not the same as inheritance rights. That difference created pressure inside the dispute. Camilla's family could point to their history with the estate. William's side could point to the inheritance structure. Both arguments might sound persuasive when separated from the paperwork. The paperwork was what mattered. The deeper the review went, the more obvious it became that the estate had never been governed by a single simple arrangement. Different records referred to different periods of use. Some dealt with maintenance, others concerned access. Still others related to the transfer of ownership after the Queen's death. That complexity gave the family room to believe there was still a legal path forward. It also gave William's lawyers a reason to keep digging. The crucial issue was not how long the family had been connected to the estate. It was whether that connection had ever created a right that could survive the Queen's inheritance decision. That question became the dividing line. If the family had only been granted access, their position could collapse. If they had received a recognized beneficial interest, the case could become much harder. If they had been promised future control, then the court would have to determine whether that promise was legally valid. And if the Queen had personally overridden those possibilities in a later document, everything could change again. That was why the private inheritance papers became so important. The records were reportedly being compared against older correspondence, property arrangements, and financial documents. The purpose was simple: establish exactly what had been promised, exactly what had been transferred, and exactly what remained under the Queen's control until her death. The investigation also exposed a psychological problem inside the family's position. They had apparently become accustomed to the estate. Familiarity can create its own sense of ownership. Years of access can make a temporary arrangement feel permanent. Repeated use can turn permission into expectation. Expectation can then become entitlement. But the law does not always follow emotion. A person can feel that a property is theirs without possessing the document that makes it theirs. That was the uncomfortable reality facing Camilla's relatives. Their argument depended heavily on what they believed the estate arrangement meant. William's argument depended on what the inheritance documents actually said. That difference was becoming harder to ignore. There was another detail that increased the tension. The estate had continued generating expenses while the ownership question remained unresolved. Someone had to authorize those costs. Someone had to account for them. Someone had to explain why certain benefits continued reaching people whose long-term rights were now being challenged. Every answer created another question. Why had those arrangements continued? Who had approved them? Were they temporary? Had anyone formally reviewed them after the Queen's death? And most importantly, had the family mistaken continued access for permanent authority? Those questions were not answered in public. They were being examined through legal channels, where a single sentence in an old document could carry more weight than years of family custom. That was also why the story became more dangerous for Camilla's relatives. The longer the review continued, the less useful personal relationships became. Royal connections could create access. They could create influence. They could create opportunities. But they could not necessarily create a valid inheritance. The financial audit therefore became more than an accounting exercise. It became a map of the family's relationship with the estate. It showed where money had moved. It showed where benefits had accumulated. It showed which arrangements were documented and which existed mainly through assumption. And somewhere within that maze was the answer William needed: the late Queen's inheritance instructions. Those instructions were not treated like ordinary family correspondence. They were part of the evidence that could determine whether the family's claim had any foundation at all. The possibility of a hidden restriction had not yet been fully exposed. But the investigators were getting closer. One document reportedly referred to an inheritance condition that did not appear in the ordinary estate records. Another reference pointed toward a separate sealed file connected to the Queen's private legal arrangements. That was the moment the dispute moved into a more dangerous phase. Until then, Camilla's family could argue that the situation was complicated. After that discovery, they faced something much harder: a specific instruction. A private instruction, and potentially an instruction written with future conflict in mind. The family's confidence began to depend on one question: what exactly had the Queen written? Because if the missing document merely confirmed William's inheritance, the dispute might still leave room for negotiation. But if it contained a direct restriction against Camilla or her relatives controlling the estate, then their entire position could be finished before the court even reached the final stage. That possibility was serious enough to force another round of private legal meetings. The lawyers needed to know what was inside the sealed file. The accountants needed to know whether the financial arrangements contradicted the inheritance record, and William needed to know whether the document gave him something stronger than a claim. It might give him the authority to remove everyone who had assumed they could stay. That was the point at which the estate stopped being a disputed property and became a test of whether a private royal instruction could survive a family challenge. The answer was now sitting inside a sealed document that had remained out of sight until this fight forced it into view. The significance of that discovery was not just legal, it changed the balance inside the family. Until the sealed file became relevant, Camilla's relatives could continue presenting themselves as people with a legitimate connection to a valuable royal property. Once the possibility of an explicit restriction emerged, that narrative became much harder to defend. It also created a new problem for anyone advising them. A public challenge could draw attention to documents that had remained private for years. A quiet settlement could mean accepting William's authority. Continuing to occupy the estate could invite stronger enforcement. There was no comfortable option. Every move carried a cost, and the closer the lawyers came to the sealed evidence, the more dangerous the next step became. The family had been fighting over access to an estate. They were about to discover that the real fight was over a sentence written long before the court case ever existed. That sentence could decide who stayed, who left, and whether William's victory was merely temporary or completely final. Nobody inside the dispute could afford to ignore it any longer. If you think William was right to enforce the late Queen's wishes, prove it by liking this story, sharing it, and subscribing now, because the next chapter opens the legal battle that exposed the evidence Camilla's family never wanted the public to see. and it gets far worse from there. The courtroom did not erupt when the evidence arrived. It went quiet. That silence mattered. For weeks, the dispute had been framed as a contest over possession and inheritance. Now the judges were looking at the material that could determine whether Camilla's family had any defensible right to remain inside the estate. William no longer needed to rely on reputation, expectation, or family custom. His legal team had brought the question down to documents. The first submissions established the competing positions. Camilla's relatives argued that their long connection to the property, their continued use of it, and the arrangements surrounding its upkeep supported their right to remain. William's lawyers challenged that interpretation. They argued that access had never been equivalent to ownership and that the Queen's private inheritance instructions carried greater authority than informal family expectations. Then the case reached the evidence that had been kept apart from the ordinary property file, a sealed packet. Its existence changed the temperature of the hearing. The document had reportedly been preserved within the late Queen's private legal records. Its importance came from its timing. It was not described as a casual note or a family message. It was presented as part of the inheritance framework governing the estate after her death. That distinction was critical. If the document confirmed William's exclusive inheritance, the family's argument would become extremely difficult. If it also restricted who could control the estate, then the dispute would move beyond competing interpretations. The court would have a direct instruction to consider. For Camilla's side, there was still one possible line of defense. The document had to be authenticated. Its wording had to be interpreted. Its legal status had to be established. A private instruction could not simply be treated as decisive because it carried the Queen's name. That gave the lawyers a narrow opening. Questions were raised about when the document had been prepared, who had witnessed it, how it had been stored, and whether later arrangements had altered its effect. Every challenge mattered because the entire future of the estate could turn on a few carefully chosen words. William's side answered each challenge with supporting records. The inheritance chain was examined. The estate's legal history was reviewed. The financial arrangements were placed beside the ownership documents. The result was uncomfortable for the opposing side. The more the records were compared, the less convincing the argument became that continued occupation created a lasting right. Still, the most important language had not yet been read aloud. That was deliberate. The court needed to establish the document's authority before relying on its most consequential provision. Until then, everyone was dealing with the possibility of a decisive clause, not its confirmed wording. That uncertainty kept the case alive. Camilla's family could still hope that the sealed evidence would contain nothing strong enough to remove them. William could not afford to assume victory. Then the legal team reached the relevant section. The inheritance provision reportedly identified William as the intended beneficiary of the estate. But that was not the part that caused the greatest concern. The document went further. It allegedly placed restrictions on control of the property and made clear that the inheritance was not an invitation for another branch of the family to assume authority over it. That was the first major reversal. The argument had been about whether William could claim the estate. The evidence suggested the more important question was whether anyone else had ever been permitted to control it after the Queen's decision took effect. The answer appeared increasingly difficult for Camilla's family to defend. But the case was not finished. William's lawyers introduced another layer of evidence concerning the way the estate had been used after the Queen's death. The records were intended to show that the dispute was not theoretical. The property had continued to generate benefits while its rightful control remained contested. That created a second pressure point. If the family had benefited from the estate while disputing William's authority, the court had to consider the consequences. Continued occupation could no longer be treated as harmless. The longer it continued, the more serious the conflict became. At this stage, the family's position reportedly hardened. Their lawyers resisted the suggestion that their presence amounted to unlawful control. They pointed to their relationship with the estate and challenged the interpretation being placed on the inheritance material. But William's side had something stronger than a relationship. It had a chain of evidence. And that chain was beginning to connect the property records, the financial review, and the private inheritance instructions. The courtroom was now dealing with a single question: who had the final authority over the estate? That question carried consequences far beyond a title on paper. If William won, Camilla's family could lose their ability to remain. If William lost, the inheritance documents could be interpreted as insufficient to prevent another claimant from retaining influence. Neither outcome was minor. Then came the moment that reportedly shifted the case decisively. The sealed evidence was examined in full. The language concerning control was more specific than the family had expected. It did not merely identify William as the heir. It reportedly established that the estate was intended to remain under his authority, and that attempts by Camilla or her relatives to assume control would conflict with the Queen's stated wishes. That was the second major reversal. The dispute was no longer about whether William had inherited the estate. It was about whether the people opposing him had any legal route around that inheritance. The answer appeared to be narrowing rapidly. The judges then had to consider the final issue. Could later family arrangements override the Queen's earlier private instructions? That question became the last refuge for the opposition. If later agreements carried enough legal weight, the family might still have a route to remain. If they did not, the court would have little reason to preserve their position. The evidence again pointed toward William. The inheritance documents were not standing alone. They were supported by the property history and the records surrounding the transfer. The case was becoming less about competing stories and more about a documented sequence of decisions. And that sequence led directly back to the late Queen. She had chosen the beneficiary. She had established conditions around the estate. She had placed those instructions inside a legal framework. Now, years later, the exact conflict those protections appeared designed to prevent had arrived. The court had reached the point where one final document could settle what remained. But that document contained something more personal than an ordinary inheritance instruction. It reportedly named the people who were not supposed to gain control. That detail changed the meaning of everything that had come before. The family had believed they were fighting to preserve access. William was preparing to enforce a restriction, and the late Queen's private decision was about to become the strongest weapon in his case. By the time the hearing moved toward its final stage, the outcome was no longer looking like a negotiation. It was beginning to look like enforcement, but the most damaging words had still not been fully exposed. Because the sealed clause did not simply say who would inherit. It reportedly explained who could never control the estate. There was also a practical consequence that could not be ignored. A court ruling could establish ownership, but removing occupants required a clear sequence of instructions. William's advisors therefore began preparing for what would happen after judgment. Notices would have to be issued. Access would have to be reviewed. Property staff would need direction. Any remaining claims would have to be dealt with through the proper legal channels. That preparation sent a message without requiring a public confrontation. William was not waiting to see whether the family accepted the ruling. He was preparing for the possibility that they would not. For Camilla's relatives, that was another blow. A temporary disagreement could have been survived. A settlement could have preserved some influence. But a fully enforceable inheritance decision would leave them with far less room to maneuver. The pressure intensified when the court considered the wording of the restriction itself. The language was reportedly designed to prevent control from passing through family influence rather than through the designated inheritance route. That meant even a future attempt to reshape the estate through private agreements could face the same barrier. The implications were immediate. The estate could not simply be treated as a family asset available to whoever had the strongest connection to it. It had rules, and those rules were about to be enforced. At that point, the dispute had reached its most dangerous stage. William had the evidence. His legal team had the argument. The court was examining the final language. Camilla's family had one remaining problem. The Queen's instructions appeared to leave them nowhere else to go legally at all. If you believe those wishes should matter more than family entitlement, make your position count now by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Do not let the people fighting against the documented inheritance be the only voices heard, because the next chapter reveals the clause itself, and that is where this entire royal dispute turns from a court battle into a personal defeat. The clause was finally opened, and the room changed before anyone had to explain why. The words reportedly settled the central dispute in a way that left Camilla's family with almost no room to maneuver. William was identified as the intended heir, but the more consequential language concerned control. The late Queen had allegedly placed a restriction around the estate that went beyond ordinary inheritance. Camilla could not take control, and members of her family could not step into that position either. That was the detail that made the court victory so damaging. For weeks, the family had been fighting over possession. Now the evidence suggested that the person who had created the inheritance arrangement had already anticipated the possibility of a future challenge. The estate was not simply being passed to William, it was being protected from a particular kind of takeover. The implication was difficult to ignore. If the clause was valid, then the family's continued presence could not be treated as a path toward control. Their history with the property could not override the restriction. Their personal connection to Camilla could not override it. Even an attempt to negotiate control through another arrangement could face the same barrier. And that was when the argument became personal. Camilla's position was no longer only about a valuable estate. It was about a family expectation that appeared to be colliding with an instruction attributed to the late Queen herself. Every challenge against William now risked appearing to challenge the inheritance decision at its source. The lawyers understood the danger immediately. They examined the wording line by line. They questioned whether the restriction applied to direct control, indirect control, management rights, or future arrangements. Those distinctions mattered because a single loophole could keep the family connected to the estate. William's legal team pushed in the opposite direction. Their position was that the Queen's intention had to be read as a whole. She had chosen the heir. She had established conditions around the property. She had also placed limits on who could control it. Separating those provisions would defeat the purpose of the arrangement. The court therefore faced a narrow but important question. Was the restriction strong enough to prevent Camilla's family from retaining practical control after William inherited the estate? The answer would determine what happened next. There was another complication. A restriction written into an inheritance document could still require careful interpretation. The opposing lawyers could argue that the wording did not automatically authorize an immediate removal. They could distinguish ownership from occupation and control from residence. That argument offered the family one final opening, but it came with a problem. The estate was no longer operating in a legal vacuum. The court had already examined the surrounding records. The financial history had been reviewed. The inheritance chain had been established. The sealed evidence had been authenticated and considered. Each piece reinforced the next. The family could challenge one document. It was harder to challenge the entire sequence. That was why William's position had become so strong. He did not need to prove that every family arrangement had been improper. He needed to establish that the final inheritance authority rested with him, and that the restrictions attached to that authority prevented another branch of the family from taking control. The clause appeared to do exactly that. The reaction from Camilla's side was reportedly immediate but controlled. There was no need for a public confrontation inside the courtroom. Lawyers requested clarification. Arguments continued over interpretation. Private discussions followed. But the direction of travel was clear. The estate was moving toward William. The family was moving toward the exit. Then came the question of enforcement. Winning a case and removing occupants are not the same thing. William's advisors needed a lawful process that would turn the judgment into action. Notices had to be prepared. Responsibilities around the property had to be reassigned. Access arrangements had to be reviewed. That practical stage made the ruling feel real. For the family, the estate was no longer an uncertain possession. It was a property they could be required to leave. And that possibility carried an emotional cost beyond money. They had spent years building familiarity with the place. They had developed routines around it. They had treated its facilities as part of their lives. Losing access meant losing more than rooms, grounds, and privileges. It meant accepting that their assumption of lasting influence had been wrong. That was the part William did not need to argue about. The documents had already done it. His public image could be debated. His family relationships could be debated. His motives could be debated. But the legal question was narrower. Who had the inheritance right? Who had control? Who had to leave? The court's answer was becoming increasingly difficult to dispute. And then another detail reportedly emerged from the inheritance material. The restriction was not presented as an accidental technical condition. It appeared to have been deliberately included to prevent the estate from drifting into the hands of people outside the designated line of control. That made the timing of the present conflict remarkable. Years after the document had been prepared, the exact kind of dispute it seemed designed to prevent had arrived. Camilla's family had challenged William. William had relied on the inheritance. The court had examined the evidence. And the Queen's private provision had become decisive. The significance reached beyond this one property. Royal estates are symbols as much as assets. Control over one can carry status, influence, access, and financial value. Losing such a property can therefore change a family's position overnight. For Camilla's relatives, the ruling threatened all of those advantages at once. For William, it established something equally important. The inheritance could be enforced. He did not have to accept an arrangement simply because it had existed for years. He did not have to preserve access because relatives had become accustomed to it. If the court recognized the restriction, then continuing the old arrangement could undermine the very inheritance the Queen had established. That was the reasoning behind the next decision. William would order the family out. The instruction was no longer a threat, it was the practical consequence of the judgment. The family was given notice that their occupation could not continue under the old terms. The estate would return to the control of its designated heir. That moment was the title's real meaning. William had not simply won an argument, he had reached the point where the legal victory could be translated into action. And for Camilla's family, that was the humiliation they had been trying to avoid. They could contest the interpretation, they could express anger, they could seek further legal advice. But none of those actions changed the central problem. The document had already been accepted as evidence. The inheritance had already been examined. The restriction had already changed the case. Now the estate itself was waiting for the consequences. There was still one question hanging over everything. How would the family react when the order was no longer theoretical? That answer would reveal just how deeply they had believed the estate belonged within their reach. Because the next stage was not another private meeting or another legal argument. It was the moment the gates, rooms, staff, and property records would all begin reflecting William's victory. The pressure was especially sharp because the family had reportedly expected the dispute to remain negotiable. Their assumption depended on time. Time could preserve routines, keep conversations open, and create opportunities for another arrangement. The court decision removed that advantage. William's order changed the timetable. Once the estate was formally placed under his authority, every day of continued occupation could become another point of conflict. The family could no longer rely on familiarity with the property as evidence of entitlement. They had to confront the possibility that their access had always depended on permission that could now be withdrawn. That realization also changed the role of the estate staff. They would have to follow the new authority. Administrative records would have to reflect the judgment. Property decisions would no longer be handled according to the old assumptions. For William, this was the moment when restraint became action. He had allowed the legal process to determine the dispute. He had not needed to create a public spectacle. Now he could let the ruling speak through the order itself. For Camilla's family, however, the order carried a different message. The fight was over. The estate was no longer theirs to treat as a permanent family foothold, and the person enforcing that conclusion was William. The most uncomfortable part was that the late Queen's alleged clause had made the decision possible long before the confrontation began. That was why the final confrontation was so watched. The legal arguments had ended, but the human consequences were only beginning. What happened at the estate next would show whether the family accepted the ruling quietly or resisted it until the last possible moment. So if you believe William was right to enforce the inheritance decision, do not simply watch and move on. Like this story, share it, and subscribe, because the next chapter shows what happened when the order reached the estate, and that reaction made an already bitter royal dispute even more explosive. The estate was quiet when the final order arrived, but the silence did not last. Camilla's relatives now had a decision in front of them that could not be pushed aside by another private conversation. According to the account at the center of this story, Prince William had won the inheritance dispute, and the order that followed required the family to leave the property. What had begun as a fight over who could remain had ended with one side holding the legal advantage and the other facing the consequences. The first signs of the change were practical. Property arrangements had to be altered. Access had to be reviewed. Staff had to understand who held authority. The family could no longer operate under the assumption that their previous position would continue indefinitely. That was the real force of the court victory. It changed the daily reality of the estate. For Camilla's relatives, the loss was not simply about leaving a building. The property represented access, status, familiarity, and influence. Their connection to it had become part of their expectations. Now those expectations had collided with the inheritance decision. The response was reportedly angry, but anger could not rewrite the documents. The estate was moving back under the control of its heir. And the person who had made that possible was not standing outside the gates demanding obedience. He had allowed the court process to establish the position first. That mattered because it gave the final order a different character. It was not presented as a sudden personal decision made in the heat of a family argument. It followed the legal victory. The distinction was central. If the ruling had gone the other way, William would have faced restrictions on what he could do with the property. Instead, the decision reportedly confirmed the inheritance arrangement and strengthened his authority to enforce it. That left Camilla's family facing a choice: leave voluntarily, or continue fighting through whatever legal avenues remained. The longer they stayed, the more complicated the situation could become. The estate itself now became the stage where the consequences were visible. People who had once moved through the property with confidence had to reconsider their position. Personal belongings had to be accounted for. Arrangements that had seemed permanent suddenly looked temporary. Conversations that once concerned ordinary property matters now carried the weight of a court decision. For anyone watching from outside, this was the moment the title became real. William had not merely won the case. He had ordered Camilla's family out, and they were reportedly furious. That anger was understandable from their perspective. But the legal dispute had never been decided by emotion. It had been decided by evidence. The inheritance documents were at the center of that evidence. The financial review had strengthened the questions surrounding the family's continued benefits. The court had then considered the private material that reportedly restricted control of the estate. Everything had converged on the same point. William was the designated heir. Camilla's family was not. That conclusion carried another consequence. The old arrangement could no longer be treated as the future. The estate needed a new structure. William's representatives could now begin deciding how the property would be managed, who would have access, and what role, if any, members of the wider family would have in its future. That is where the emotional meaning of the dispute became clearer. The property had never been only about rooms, grounds, or financial value. It represented a question of succession. Who gets to decide what happens after the previous generation is gone? Who gets to preserve an inheritance? And who has to accept that a relationship with the former owner does not create a permanent right to the asset? Those questions explain why the conflict became so bitter. Camilla's family had reportedly believed that their established connection gave them a position worth defending. William's side argued that the inheritance documents gave him the stronger claim. The court ultimately sided with William. The result was not simply a change in who occupied the estate. It established a boundary. Family influence could not automatically override inheritance rights. Familiarity could not automatically become ownership, and years of access could not automatically defeat a written restriction. That boundary may be the most important part of the entire story, because once it was established, the dispute could no longer be treated as a temporary disagreement between relatives. The legal outcome had consequences for the future. The estate was now attached to William's authority. Camilla's relatives had to adjust to that reality, and the late Queen's alleged instruction became the reason the entire sequence had reached this point. That is what makes the sealed clause so significant. Without it, the dispute might have remained a complicated argument over competing interpretations. With it, the story became much more direct. The Queen had reportedly anticipated the possibility of unwanted control passing through another branch of the family. She had allegedly placed protection around the inheritance. And when the dispute eventually arrived, those protections were used to support William's position. Whether every detail of the account survives further scrutiny is a separate question. The central narrative, however, rests on the idea that the inheritance documents were decisive in determining who could control the estate. That distinction matters. Royal stories often become consumed by personalities. This one ultimately turns on paperwork, a signature, a clause, a legal interpretation, a court decision, and then an order at the gates. That sequence is what transformed the dispute from private family tension into a public spectacle. For William, the outcome offered something more valuable than a dramatic confrontation: certainty. He could move forward knowing that the estate was no longer caught between competing claims. For Camilla's family, certainty came in another form. They knew they had lost the position they had fought to preserve. That is why the reported reaction was so bitter. The family was not simply being asked to change rooms. They were being forced to accept that the future of the estate would be decided without them. And once that reality settled in, the dispute took on a larger meaning. The Queen's final wishes had outlasted the people around her. The inheritance had survived the challenge, and William had emerged with the authority to enforce it. The estate became more than a property. It became a symbol of succession and the consequences of ignoring a written decision. There was no need for William to publicly humiliate anyone. The ruling had already spoken. There was no need for another family confrontation. The order had already been issued. There was no need to prove who held the stronger position through spectacle. The documents had done that work. And that is where the story leaves its most uncomfortable question. What happens when people believe family connections should be enough to preserve an advantage, only to discover that the person who controls the inheritance planned for that possibility years earlier? That question reaches beyond this estate. It reaches into every family dispute where memory competes with paperwork, where tradition competes with legal authority, and where people discover too late that access was never the same thing as ownership. For viewers who have followed the story from the first court filing to the final order, the lesson is difficult to miss. The battle was never truly settled at the gates. It was settled inside the documents. The gates were simply where everyone finally saw the result, and the final image is therefore not William arguing with Camilla's relatives. It is the estate after the confrontation, quieter, more controlled. No longer caught between competing expectations, the person named in the inheritance now has the authority to decide what comes next. The family that once believed it could remain must accept that the arrangement has changed, and the clause that reportedly caused the greatest anger remains the detail that explains why. William did not need to invent a new inheritance. He only needed to enforce the one he was said to have received. That is the part viewers should remember when the arguments begin again, because royal disputes rarely end when the court closes a case. They continue through reactions, questions, new revelations, and the consequences that follow after everyone leaves the courtroom. If this story made you believe the inheritance should be respected, do not stay silent while the people who opposed it control the conversation. Like this video, share it with someone following the royal dispute, and subscribe to this channel. Turn on notifications, because the next story coming here goes even deeper, and what happens next may be far more explosive than the fight that brought William to those gates.